To break down the diplomatic and political fallout of the U.S. decision, joining me now is Oğuz Çelikol, who is the former Turkish ambassador to Syria and Israel, and Amr Orhan, who is a journalist at Walla News, which is based in Tel Aviv. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. Good to have you on. Mr. Ambassador, if you'd allow me, I'd like just to first question to Amr. The reality is that the Golan Heights has been occupied by Israel since 1967. And I think it's fair to say no one should expect the territory to be handed back to Syria anytime soon. So what do you make of President Trump's coming out with this proclamation? What's the reasoning behind it?
We heard Prime Minister Netanyahu say that Israel never had a better friend than Donald Trump at the Oval Office. What he meant to say was that Bibi Netanyahu never had a better friend than Trump. Because obviously, when Trump said that the time is right, he meant election time in Israel. There was no impetus for this. This came out of the blue. The situation on the ground has not changed in many years, essentially since the 1973 war between Israel and Syria, as well as between Israel and Egypt, when the current lines have been drawn, a UN force is there. There was no need for that. Now, we have been marking only this week the 40th anniversary of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. And of course, one of the most basic tenets of this treaty is land for peace. UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. And the same principle applies to the other sectors. Of course, Palestine or Jordan is a more complicated case, but it was obvious that should Syria agree to the same principles that Anwar Sadat did, it will get all or most of the Golan Heights back.
Okay, you mentioned the elections. We're going to pick up that conversation in just a bit, but I want to turn to Ambassador Çelikol. Is this sort of a hornet's nest that didn't need stirring, or is this part of sort of a calculated move in Donald Trump's strategy?
I think Mr. Trump is going to run for the next term in the United States, and in Israel, of course, we are going to have elections very soon. But in America also elections started. And Mr. Trump also needs friends. And probably he sees Prime Minister Netanyahu as his friend. Because in that signing ceremony, Prime Minister Netanyahu mentioned three names. One was British Foreign Minister Balfour, the other one American President Truman, and the third one was the Persian king, Great Cyrus. And I have written several American, comments about this, because in the evangelist, political base of Mr. Trump, who he won, of course, the last election in 2016, on the evangelist support, the Cyrus the Great played a very important role because the Jews believe that he emancipated them, he led them, to Palestine, he let them build temples, and there is a kind of likening between Cyrus the Great and Mr. Trump. Okay. So Mr. Trump needs friends also.
All right, so both of you gentlemen are actually coming together on one common issue, elections, on both sides of the Atlantic, per se. Amr, let me turn to you. How is this likely to affect Netanyahu's re-election bid? But also let's keep in mind that he has some looming indictments in terms of corruption charges around him.
Well, Netanyahu obviously worked for that. We have seen in the back row there in the Oval Office Israeli ambassador to Washington, Ron Dermer, who is American-born and was actually a Republican minor politician or staff aide in Florida before he emigrated to Israel. And obviously, politics had a lot to do with it. And in the run-up to the Israeli elections, this is what Dermer and Netanyahu's friends around Trump pulled off. Now, obviously, Netanyahu hoped for some impact, but in actuality, he got none. And this is because of what happened in Israel with the rocket hitting central Israel launched out of Gaza, and because of what you mentioned, his bleak legal future, which looms over the entire election campaign.
Okay, Ambassador Chilikol, just like we saw in the decision to recognize Israel's capital as Jerusalem on the Trump administration, Turkey is actually sort of towing the line in terms of getting the international condemnation on this. Are we expecting, can we expect any sort of repercussions coming out of this?
Well, apparently, of course, this last decision is not going to have any international support at all, because apparently Europeans very clearly came against Trump's decision. Because the situation on the ground in the Middle East is already a very difficult situation, and nobody wants to aggravate the situation further. One, of course, always hope that, and it is a diplomat's duty to be positive, if there is going to be a change in the Israel after the election, one can hope that the peace talks with the Palestinians and the Israelis will start afterward.
We'll see how that is. Ambassador, let me just get Amir in there. The ambassador mentioned that no one wants to sort of complicate the situation even more, but when you sort of look at the region, Iran is expanding its influence, whether it's through building militia or sending in weapons. We know that Israel has sort of retaliated by conducting more than 1,000 airstrikes in the situation. There's also a delicate balance, a delicate dance with Russians that are in this region. I mean, isn't this going to complicate the situation?
There is a difference between Netanyahu and Israel. And one should never forget that what is good for Netanyahu is not necessarily good for Israel, and he does not reflect the Israeli national interest per se. And there is also a contradiction between what the national security establishment of Israel, mostly led by the military, which is the most important part of the Israeli machinery, but also the other parts of the strategic decision-making body in Israel, and the political view and the political interest of Netanyahu himself. So you don't see anything coming up, bubbling up from the machinery calling for this annexation or this recognition. Actually, Trump went much further than Israel ever did, because Israel said, well, this is not really annexation. We are only applying our administration and our laws.
And our laws there.
Now, of course, this is going to contribute to a more precarious situation, because the initiative is now going to be with the Syrians. If Assad decides to emulate what Hamas has been doing and launch just a rocket or two into the Golan, or even further south or east into Israel, and say, listen, guys, I am willing to come back to the table, but if you are not, let me just heat up the conversation.
Okay, and Ambassador, I want to ask you, does this sort of go against sort of the basic principles of international law when you actually have a country taking over a territory by force, or a country recognizing that as can't this be a double standard in the future? We've seen the example with Russia and the annexation of Crimea. Isn't there sort of an hypocrisy on the side of the United States then?
Unfortunately, this is going to be a bad example, because obviously, of course, there is United Nations resolutions against the annexation of Golan Heights by Israel, because when the Knesset passed that law in 1981, there was a United Nations Security Council resolution, which considered that null and non-void. And there are, of course, general international law that is against absorbing territory by force. But in this case, there is certain United Nations Security Council resolution which passed with the American support. That is also interesting, because in 1981, America did not prevent passage of the resolution which condemned the annexation of Golan Heights that time. Of course, from that on, there were some American initiatives also between Syria and Israel to make a peace between these two countries on the basis of which you mentioned, on the recognition for territory.
Gentlemen, this is a very deep and lengthy discussion, but I'm afraid we've just run out of time. Thank you very much, Ambassador Oz Chelikol and Amir Oran, for joining us here on Straight Talk.